Good morning and a very warm welcome to this week's episode of Full Scottish. We've got a really interesting lineup for us this week. We're going to talk about Russia, all things spies, bots, attempted murders, what's going on there, poison, what's happening. Obviously International Women's Day this week, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. We'll have our story of the week as normal. We're going to talk a little bit about music, the closure of the NME. Fantastic action-packed show. So without further ado, let's get on with the show.
Good morning, welcome to Full Scottish. I'm Richard Walker.
I'm Suzanne McLaughlin.
And we have got an action-packed show, as Suzanne said in the introduction to you this morning. Our guests today are Professor Alison Phipps, who is Professor of Languages and Intercultural Studies and the UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts, and Dr. Gavin Slade, Lecturer in Legacies of Communism. Welcome both. We're going to start as normal with our stories of the week. So, Alison, what's been grabbing your attention this week?
Yeah, do you know, my story of the week really was just one of the most intelligent pieces of analysis I've seen around the Me Too hashtag and around women's labour. And it was a piece by Moira Weigel, who's a Harvard Society Fellow, in Logic magazine, and it was called The Internet of Women. And it was really a very intelligent material analysis of all the free labour that's going on the internet and the way in which women are exposing and using the internet, but also it was very much trying not to romanticise the way the internet works. And it wasn't just going to all those nasty ends of the internet that so many people have experienced, and obviously that Mari Black was exposing so brilliantly in Westminster this week, and which went viral, but was really looking at the way in which generations of women have suffered witch hunts right from the Middle Ages and always around their labour. And she kind of concludes it with this wonderful description of the way in which things that women have always said to each other between women that we've known as truths but haven't been able to share in the public space are now being shared in the public space. But this is a labour for which nobody's being paid. And she then says, but what happens when enough people whisper truths about their lives? It casts a powerful spell, she says, and that is really the kind of murmurations that we're living with the hashtag world now, and particularly under the Me Too hashtag, but many others, and we saw that, and I know we'll speak about this later with International Women's Day. But she's really looking at the free labour that women do on the internet, not romanticising it, looking at who gets paid for writing and who doesn't, where's that happening, distinctions between print media, where there are salaries, and then all the areas of work largely done by women around the emancipation of women and the Me Too hashtag. And she just keeps saying, these murmurations give us a question, which is, well, what now? What now?
That's interesting. What sort of, in terms of the internet, when you're talking about the work that women do that is not paid, is that mainly writing, or is it?
Whether it be writing or blogging or just tweeting and posting on Facebook. And she has this beautiful section where she says, you know, it's easy to go and not more cats, more kittens, more pictures of what your dinner is, but actually what that's doing is showing you the labour that women do. So for me, this links into things like the women's strike, and we heard at Hillhead Library this week from a woman who's been involved in the women's strike in Spain, and it was a really interesting way of saying those things which have usually been hidden in the home, haven't been out on the streets, are now on the street that is the internet. You can see what people are eating, who's made it, when it's happened, and so that's then exposing labour in other ways. And all the different ways in which that labour is gendered, has been assumed and hasn't been paid for in the past.
I suppose as well, that type of communication on the internet is often derided as being superficial in a way that I guess some other people's comments are not.
That's right. That's right.
How does that happen? Why is that regarded as being somehow inferior to political discourse?
Well, it's the same as all we talked a few weeks ago. It feels as if the resident charity feminist, I'm always banging on about it, but it's so relevant in every single part. We talked a few weeks ago about even the food and the drink that that some women tend to prepare. We talked about the fact that rosé wine is viewed by wine, although it's one of the most complicated, any wine grower will tell you it's a really complicated and complex wine to make, but because women like it, or it's pink, it's derided and seen as somehow not a wine that's, you would never see a programme where a wine buff was talking about rosé wine, but yet when they talk to them privately, they're like, it's a really difficult wine to get right. So it's in every single part, so everything women do, women's literature, chick lit, the most insulting, that brings us in a wee bit to some things we've talked before about why is popular offensive. This is literature that's funny, clever, quirky, relaxing, and again it's derided and smart and witty. Marianne Keyes talked about as one of the queens of chick lit, shall we say, one of the most intelligent women. She's heavily involved in Repeal the 8th campaign, she's smart, she's clever, a journalist that's on 40 years standing, 20 novels under, but somehow chick lit, derided to this tiny little...
And you can always see it signalled, whenever you have something that says this is African literature, or this is post-colonial literature, or this is women's literature, because something's been put in front of the word literature as a qualifier, that you're into a dodgy area. You're into an area where certain groups of people are going to have already been marginalised, and this is a way of signalling it. So I think this, for me, was one of the most intelligent pieces in writing about the internet as a woman, as doing women's labour, and looking at that really powerful analysis.
Absolutely.
Did you say the Brewdog have produced a beer for women? Did you say this?
This is the pink one.
Yeah, the pink one. But it's done with the hashtag sarcasm.
Yeah, well, if you have to say sarcasm, you're missing it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what they missed. I mean, they tried to be hip and right on and clever and funny, but it's a bit like, if you have to put emoticon at the end, you're not making your point clearly.
And eating it at the same time.
It's
it's a bit new lad.
Very much so,
Suzanne, your story of the week as well is related in some way to...
Well, it's
that?
Not so much a story of the week as a sort of stories, a collective, in gender, and several of the other women's organisations, Women 50/50, fantastic organisations, encouraged women on the internet that ties in under the hashtag Making Work Visible to tweet the day, Facebook the day, whatever it is. So the additional, the phrase sometimes used is emotional labour that women do. So be it something as simple as up early, stick a washing on, put out the cereal, or flick the switch in the coffee maker, remember it's their mother-in-law's birthday, we know we've got to buy a card on the way into work, get stamps to post that card on the way back, pick up dinner, and do big jobs. So at the same time, and so there was all these fantastic stories from single mums at home to Talit Yacoub, who's a Director-in-Chief of Women 50/50, her doing a day, so in charge of a third sector organising, a very busy one, on several boards, very brilliant woman. So she was doing it and still having to, run out at lunchtime to Tesco's to get done, and I think what this, for me, reading the hashtag and all the stories and women's stories of just how much they do, it reminded me that every woman effectively does 2 jobs, and if they've got children, they do 3. And I was looking at one of the last studies is that informal childcare, so i.e. parenting by the mother or grandparents, usually grandmothers or grandfathers. In 2010, it was worked out as 23% of, if it was paid, of the UK's GDP. Yet somehow, anyway, the International Monetary Fund, no one really quantifies the value of this economic labour. And if this emotional labour wasn't done by women, and if this informal childcare wasn't done, the economy, according to men and the International Monetary Fund, would just go into a halt. It would just stop. What does we know? It would just stop. So is it time to start looking about it and paying a bit more attention? And again, I totally agree with what Alison's saying. All these things that are derided on the internet, like kittens and dinners, is very, very important. Because someone's got to feed the cats and make the dinner.
Fits in a lot with Professor Alison Mackay's work, the late Professor Alison Mackay's work on gender budgeting, and the ways in which it's largely the labour of women to provision. and that provisioning. And so what would a budget look like where we actually built that in and said, so rather like we've done with triple bottom line accounting or environmental budgets, what would it look like if we brought that in?
Well, society is just stupidly ungendered in every single part of it. And we talked a wee bit about women just being shoved into the current state, as Mary Black brilliantly said as well, is that these structures were built. And yes, there is a will to stick women in. You know, there is a recognition amongst men that, you know, women have, but you're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. We really need to just smash the patchwork and start again.
Oh, simple as that. Gavin.
On to communism.
Gavin. So, Gavin, what was your story?
Well, I've just realised I haven't wished my mum a happy Mother's Day yet. So,
Well, let's do that now.
yes,
Happy Gavin's Mother's Day.
Yes, in recognition of all the difficult labour she did in bringing me up, for example. I was a terrible child. Yeah, well, so my story of the week is around the Russian spy scandal, which I think we'll maybe go on to in more detail.
Yeah.
So that is a big issue.
Yes.
I think also, Richard, you mentioned the closure of the NME, and that
Indeed.
being a big story.
That's certainly my story, because the NME, for me, was this seminal publication which opened your eyes and ears to all sorts of different. I know you are, but let me say my piece before you so truly knock it down. It was a way of learning about new types of music. I remember specifically what the NME, in the depths of time, way back in the mists of time, was pretty much just an industry publication, and it was taken over by writers from the underground press, and they made it a much more relevant publication, and then it started talking about drugs and the political aspects of music, and it was some fantastic writers. And then again it reinvented itself in the age of punk, and you got Tony Parsons and Julie Burchill in, and what was the prime place for information in the mainstream about punk music and its related sort of adjuncts. So it was an incredibly important publication. For me, it's a very sad day when it closes, because it suggests to me that music is no longer serving that function of binding generations together. You have a different view of the NME?
I'm not pleased it's closing down.
Right.
Absolutely. As we've seen in other stories, anything that's culture, the arts, music, and jobs and journalism, print media, I'm absolutely, please don't think that I'm pleased the NME is closing down. Do I think that it's been a little bit of the architect of its own destruction? Yes.
Wow.
Again, it comes down to the NME. It was male writers, male critics, who, again, not one of them would look at the brilliance of Taylor Swift. A young woman who has written how many songs, how many Grammys, I couldn't even begin to tell you. Some of the most clever lyrics, self-deprecating, funny, clever, wildly popular, sells out stadium tours. She would have been passed off as a wee girl that they weren't interested in. Women are largely ignored by male music critics. It was if it was a woman, it wasn't any good, and again, derided as not being serious, back into what Alison and I was saying at the beginning. And the NME didn't grasp that popular is good. I find this with so many things with male. It's like, what's popular must be rubbish. And NME, it didn't try to expand, change, grow with the future. And if it had done, maybe if it had Taylor Swift or Britney on the front cover, or even youth bands which they put down. I've got teenagers.
I do wonder if those types of artists like Britney Spears, do they need that type of publicity from NME? I mean, they're already out there. I mean, those types
does
of
the Rolling
artists particularly.
Stones, but I've seen a big huge article on them.
I always felt that NME served more of that purpose of showing groups that didn't necessarily have that momentum and bringing them into people's lives. And
I get that. I get what you're saying, but I don't think they would ever what would be classed as. My teenagers are into this band. My daughter's into Imagine Dragons, this teenage band. They're quite a cool, kind of hip teenage band, but they're nevertheless that sort of medium. There's a lot of little girls at the concert, and they're not a boy band per se, as in put together. But would NME have covered them? Anything that's liked by teenagers or girls, NME largely ignored. Again, it was white middle-aged men.
And that brings up, it reminds me of a piece in the Herald today by Katrina MacDonald about Scottish Youth Theatre. And I think, what you're saying, Suzanne, actually brings up questions about, well, where is it that this intergenerational space is actually available around art and culture?
Absolutely.
And you know, the piece on Scottish Youth Theatre, which has lost its funding from Creative Scotland, and you know, when I think about Stella Quines as well, which you know has obviously been a thorny issue around their loss of funding and the need to think again around that, it strikes me that there's a lot of deep thinking needed within Creative Scotland and the culture industry at the moment about how different groups are represented,
Absolutely.
how core funding is sustained for those groups which are more marginalised as opposed to those who, as you're saying, Gavin, might not have needed the publicity. So I think there's a wider set of issues brought up by this particular story.
The intergenerational thing's interesting. I'm not making any assumptions here. It's
Yeah,
true for me as well that the NME, when I was growing up but this sort of, if you think about the early 90s when you had those sort of big, that was also the lads culture starting to creep in. But you had this sort of oasis where you know, the competition around those groups, but that it was the NME to some degree that also introduced me. So intergenerationally, there might be some commonality we share with that,
but then you don't
whether it's I can see that we're speaking to each other.
Do you know what?
We're speaking to each other.
So maybe that is part of NME's problem, that they're only appealing to young white men.
I think yes. I think you've got some valid points there. But I would say that one of the best pieces I ever read in NME was by Chrissy Hind before The Pretenders, and she wrote an amazing piece about David Cassidy and the teen who was, for those who don't know, at the time a teen idol. Girls screamed whenever he appeared.
You googled that to throw at us.
No, I did not. I did not.
You've got whether it be an influential female.
No. I take your point. This I'm not using this as to argue against what you're saying. But it was nevertheless, I think what I'm saying is that another purpose the NME served was to bring some intellectual rigour into popular culture and to understand the messages of popular culture sent and the purposes, in this case, of teen idols to its audience, which was interesting.
There's also a certain angle they took. I mean, so I used to read, and it's still going, Kerrang, because I was into heavy metal, and you know that was purely aimed at a male audience, and it was written by men. But it was also reflecting that particular subculture,
genre,
which was predominantly male as well, particular performers. You know, you very rarely saw heavy metal groups with female performers in them. Yeah. So, I mean, there was a gendered bias. I mean, I think that the publication was only reflecting the bias that was already there in the industry.
Yeah. I think that's not so much because that is a particular, you know, NME professed itself to be music. Well, whereas Kerrang was very much speaking to an audience, one particular genre. So I don't know if there's much of a problem with Creative that you know that doesn't seem. But I think something that professes itself to be the music newspaper that ignores young people or whole genres and a whole sex is.
So, anyway.
Do you think it comes into? Sorry, just quickly. Do you think this with talking about this intergeneration going back a couple of years now? So it's certainly not news, but. Same with the Arches, with the closure of the Arches, and what that was to popular culture. And I grew up with the Arches, but there was, you know, with the bar, there was cafe, there was theatre, there was performance art, there was clubbing, and it seemed to me very, I don't like the phrase, but very virtue signaling of the council at that time. They had to close it down, you know, kind of. You know, let's be realistic. Drugs are part of young people's society and part of our clubs. And every club in all the land, you will go in and find someone using. But it seemed to me that we're making this big stand, and without any thought as to what that meant to young people and their escape and their introduction to the arts and music.
Yeah.
I think the Arches story was a tragedy, and also because the Arches itself was very keen to bring the police on side and to deal with drugs, and in actual fact got penalised.
They were their own because they were honest about the issues. And
however, so farewell NME. Let's turn our attention now to Putin. The attempted murder of an ex-Russian spy and his daughter. And I suppose, Gavin...
It's like a Bond movie to me.
Yes, it does.
It does sound like a Bond movie.
It's exciting.
But Bond movies are fiction. And is this, I guess, trying to lay this at Putin's door? Is that true, basically, I guess I'm asking? Is this necessarily Russia, or could it be some rogue individuals?
Well, I mean, this is the big problem that we've gone back to this age of like Kremlinology and the black box of the Russian elite, in which we're not entirely sure what's going on, what sort of machinations are occurring within Russia. So a lot of it's guesswork and inferences. I mean, to my mind, I would say that this, I'm not entirely sure why everyone's been so cautious. I mean, to my mind, this clearly looks like something that would have been state-sponsored. It's come down from the government. You know, if there's a drone strike in Syria or in the Middle East that's sanctioned by the US government, we don't ask, you know, did Trump have knowledge of this? Did Obama have knowledge of this? Did David Cameron know when there were those strikes, you know, against Jihadi John? They knew. They ordered it. And this, I mean, in Russia there is a law which allows the government to extrajudicially kill individuals that are accused of extremism, that was passed in 2006, and that extremism is interpreted in an incredibly broad way. So it can include anyone who insults the president. It can include people who are involved in mass disturbance, hooliganism. And hooliganism in the Soviet period was a very broad catch-all term for prosecuting lots of people and sending them off to the camps. So, I mean, there are the legal mechanisms to do this. So if this was in the Western context, you know, it would be very clear. You'd say, well, this was a hit against somebody who was supposedly a threat to the motherland. And in the Russian case, because the government doesn't come out and say, we did this, there's always this, well, it's not clear who did it, who didn't do it. But we have already a precedent for this, which is the Litvinenko case in 2006. That was clearly, I mean, there was the inquiry that was fulfilled, and, you know, they came to the conclusion that it was probably ordered by Putin. The type of chemicals that are used, the methods that are involved, it looks like this would have to come from people who have this type of training, which is probably from the spy services, the security services. That's the FSB, which is the predecessor of the KGB, or the inheritor of the KGB. So, to my mind, I don't really see why people have been so cautious about it. It looks
quite psychedelic, and what psychedelic?
Yeah, I think
possibly psychedelic.
I really,
in layman terms.
You know, the other way that people try to see it is they say, well, perhaps it's about, you know, some sort of business interest that got touched on, you know, so you end up with maybe some oligarch or maybe it's organised crime groups. And the key thing to note about Russia, as the evolution of sort of violence in Russia, how it's monopolised, how it got fragmented after the collapse of the Soviet Union and then re-monopolised, is that there's a huge amount of blurring between these things anyway. So big business, state agents and organised criminal groups tend to be rather blurred. So it becomes very difficult to pick it apart and say, well, this could have been the interest of a particular rogue group of actors, let's say, or an organised crime group. And there's plenty of evidence for that. I mean, there is this type of collusion. At the moment, there's a big case in Spain going on that involves a Minister of Parliament, a Duma member. It involves members of organised crime, serious mafia members, and it also involves big Russian business companies like Lukoil, which is a private company but have been involved in Spain. And Litvinenko was giving information about that type of activity and the collusion between business, big business, and the state in money laundering, for example, in places like Spain and the UK. So these types of things are very difficult to parse out then, to understand, you know, why someone might have been hit. That's another question. But the idea that the state wasn't somehow involved, to my mind, it seems unlikely, particularly for this type of thing where we're looking at particular types of chemicals that are used and a particular type of method that seems to have been employed. It's hard to reach any other conclusion, in my opinion.
Although Alison, the West has always had a difficult relationship with Russia, I think, to understate it, and we tend to view it has been used by governments here as a bogeyman.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it quite difficult to differentiate between what might be anti-Russian propaganda for certain aims and what actually we should be worried about in terms of what Russia gets up to?
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that, you know, there's been a long history in the West, and I grew up in the Cold War, and that it was very much part and parcel at that point. But also, it comes back to what we were talking about with popular culture as well. That popular culture has made a lot of money out of many a dramatisation of the spy novel where it's a demonising of Russia as part of the Cold War. And I look at even the way we use certain phrases. If you say the word oligarchy, people will jump in and say Russian, they won't jump in and say American. So the way that we actually even think about money and where it is and who handles it and how they handle it, we have ways of understanding that, and we put those into good boxes and bad boxes, much of which is constructed out of popular culture, popular assumptions, and the ways in which which we've all grown up on, the Bond movie, and those structures. So I do think we're into a situation here where there's a lot of suspicion and a lot of fear, and rightly so. If people are using nerve agents, that is extraordinarily damaging. If there are extrajudicial killings going on in other countries, that's extremely worrying. But I think we shouldn't forget that the assassination of Osama bin Laden was an extrajudicial killing, and that to me it brings us back to the importance of the rule of law, and why we have a justice system, and why it is right that people stand trial, even when those are political trials, and what those political trials can do, and that we're here seeing again what happens to people when, as Gavin's pointing out, this seems to have been a state-sponsored action, when an extrajudicial killing happens and we do not have a way of understanding how the rule of law has been brought to bear, or no place where trials have been had in other contexts.
Well, it's not alone. From what you were saying when you were talking, this blurring at the top, the elite, shall we say, in every single country, there is absolutely this mix, and this power corrupts is never so true as when it's, and those at the top of government in almost every country have their fingers in pies and on boards, or their brothers-in-laws, or their sisters-in-laws, or their sons, or their daughters at the top of the big business and shady connections and the media, and we've seen hundreds of that in the UK even. It's not this in America. This is not something that's unique to Russia, but as Alison was saying, it's very much the baddie. Like, people have made Russia this baddie, and it doesn't seem to me this is to not lighten the fact that people are poisoned, but there was I don't recall the exact details, but there was a few years ago there was Israel, there was rumours about Israel having people's passports being used, and there was assassinations in Italy, and there was state sponsored, and that just went away, and I am absolutely sure this is happening. Just maybe we found out about this, or it suits us for Russia to be the baddie.
That there is an issue with the Putin regime, I think. I mean, if you say Russia, it's to my mind, if I'm saying Russia, it's a shorthand for the Putin regime. The regime in Russia, the key question becomes, like with the Osama bin Laden killing, I completely agree with the point about this, like the extrajudicial killings, once that's taking place around the world, this is what Putin does constantly. So if you say there's corruption in Russia, he says, well, what about the House of Lords, the expenses scandals? They say, well, what about these extrajudicial killings? He'll point to, well, you do this too. So you sort of give him this moral blank check constantly, because he said he can always refer back. Now, in his case, I think it's always to an extra degree. But yeah, this is a problem. So I totally get the idea that we could condemn all forms of extrajudicial killing. That as a logic of or a way of doing statecraft is a bad idea. On the other hand, with the bin Laden killing, for example, in that case, you have a very clear reason. There's a you say, well, he's responsible for this particular crime. In this case, we're always confused. I mean, why would this person supposedly is a retired spy. He's living in a cul-de-sac in Salisbury, and he's keeping his name. His address, his post goes under his name. Why?
He's not hard to find.
Yeah, why would this be the person? And he was in a Russian prison. They could have done whatever they wanted to him in the Russian prison. So, that becomes this sort of murky world then, where you're moving down into this area of, well, what could the connections be? We don't actually know enough really about what this person was involved in. So that's been the big question for me, has been thinking about, what's really the motive here for doing this. So in the Litvinenko case, there was a clear motive. He was working with this oligarch, so sorry to use the word again, shorthand for a very rich person from Russia, Berezovsky, and he was working for the MI6. He was giving information about this activities in Spain, which there is evidence that Putin money laundered through Spain in the 1990s when he was the deputy. He was working in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. He had a certain amount of power. He made a lot of money there. And what did he do with that money? And there's a lot of evidence that he funneled it through Spain. So there was an issue that maybe Litvinenko was touching on, issues that went again right up into the Kremlin. And so you could sort of see with this Sergei Skripal, it's not the logic seems strange. And one thing I've seen produced in certain interpretations are that on next Sunday there'll be an election in Russia, and if you're watching the presidential debates, as I've been doing, I mean, it's a complete sham, it's a farce, it's ridiculous. Putin doesn't engage in the debates. There are a bunch of opposition leaders who are presenting themselves as possible presidential candidates. It's ridiculous. I mean, they just stand around throwing insults at each other. They stand around sort of talking about who would have been shot under Stalin if Stalin was still alive. You know, it's not a debate. If you're a Russian watching this, you'd be thinking this isn't. You know, the main opposition candidate has been banned from running. So you're looking at a sham. So, I mean, in that case, how do you legitimate these elections? Now, we've already seen him stand up last week and talk about the nuclear capabilities that Russia's developed now, which are invincible. This plays well to the domestic audience. So one logic has been, you know, these types of killings abroad, the whole logic would be that it will create a storm in Britain. It will have this huge anti-Russian effect. So everybody comes out with all these anti-Russian statements, and this just bolsters Putin, because then he turns around and points to what the West is saying about him. I don't fully buy that narrative, but that's the narrative some people have been spinning. I don't think that that's right. I think it's more likely the Litvinenko case. So what's happened is basically, I think that Sergei Skripal was probably still giving information to the MI6, and it could have been information about anything. It doesn't have to be about Russia's state secrets. It could have been about business interests. It could have been about, because I mean, really, again, the collusion between business and the state in Russia means that if you want to really get at the political actors in Russia, you try and do it through their assets. It's not really about ideology or bringing them down in that way, delegitimating them that way. It's really about what sort of assets do they have hidden, where are they? And so you've got these guys who used to work for the security agents who basically became private. You privatised the police state in the 1990s, and all these guys started moonlighting and selling what they knew on the market. And I think that this is what this guy possibly was. Maybe he was still doing that. So there might have been a practical reason why this actually occurred. But I'd certainly move the debate along to why, rather than just who did it. I think it's pretty clear. To my mind, it's pretty clear.
I mean, one of the things that really interests me about this is, because it's at least two people. I mean, there's questions as well about other family members.
Yes.
But to me, it's also it's an asylum case and it's a family reunion case. So here you've got Sergei Skripal, who has been granted political asylum in the UK as part of the spy swap. And that's a really interesting case because we associate political asylum, when we talk about political asylum, we think that's a good thing. And yet the general narrative around asylum is far more fraught and difficult. And yet here we've got a classic situation of somebody whose life was clearly in danger. And also the life of members of his family, because we also have his daughter Yulia Skripal. And aside from ways in which she's being portrayed in the tabloid media and sexualised, and the images that are being used of her, which continue to just demonstrate how out of control our media is in its representation of women in all walks of life. You've got a situation where here we have the daughter of somebody granted political asylum who was able to be reunited with her father in this country, and to me that was then it's a side story. It's not the story about why did this happen, but it actually points to me to the questions about why it's important that we do have systems of asylum, why we're able to grant protection, but also the dangers that continue to all refugees wherever they live in the world, that they are always in a situation where they might not yet be completely safe, and that the story of Sergei and Yulia Skripal are actually not unlike the situation that Eritrean refugees will find themselves in across Europe, where recently one of my stories of the week last week was the story in the Dutch and Belgian press that about 80% of the interpreters for Eritrean asylum seekers in courts of law are actually planted by the Eritrean state and are therefore not necessarily giving accurate interpretation and translation, and that then means that information is going back to the state that then, as I know, is then used against families back in Eritrea. So the question of how states provide protection, the questions of how asylum refugee status is protected, plays into these much bigger questions that you're talking about, Gavin, about international relations and about the questions of crimes committed in international contexts and the importance of international law to protect people no matter where they find themselves.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting to draw those types of parallels, I think. I mean, it's one of the, I suppose, criticisms when you talk about, well, what can Britain do about this type of thing? I mean, it's very interesting when you think people like Berezovsky, this very well-resourced oligarch from the 1990s who was in London, I mean, he had political asylum because he said, well, my life is under threat if I stay in Russia. But actually, by claiming asylum in Britain, he probably put his life under more threat. If he'd been in Russia and been imprisoned, as Khodorkovsky as well was a big name oligarch again in Russia, the owner of Yukos, was imprisoned. I mean, so he's still alive now, he's living abroad as well, but he did a jail sentence. Actually, by claiming the asylum, this is then, again, interpreted in Russia as an act of treachery, and it makes you a target for these sort of, I think, big name people. So it's very interesting to think about, if you take away that the whole veneer of them being these really rich folk. But around Berezovsky there was lots of people who ended up dead, and that's a lot of deaths are now being reinvestigated around his particular case. And it wasn't just him; it was the people who were lawyers and financial advisors that sort of all sort of came a cropper, it seems, and under circumstances that were quite suspicious. So. Yeah, it's interesting to think about them just as plain political.
It's funny though, because the end of the Cold War, I suppose, was supposed to signal a much healthier relationship with Russia, and for a while it seemed.
Well, there was for a while, wasn't
it did
there?
seem
when I was a teenager, Letter to Brezhnev was a big movie, and all these things, and it was this kind of warmth, and there was a wee space there, wasn't there, where it was.
Or was there? Are we wrong to suggest that things seemed to be a source of optimism until Putin came in?
Yes, I think that you have after 9/11, the big story was that Putin was the first person to call, right, Bush, and offer condolences and say we'll do whatever it takes, and I think this will go to the issue around Syria, but I think the issue has always been, from the Russian perspective, since Putin came to power, is to be taken seriously and to be held up as an equal partner. So, I mean, of course, there was good relations when Yeltsin was in power, and Russia was doing everything that the West was saying, especially in terms of opening up their markets to foreign investment. And, the big thing about the Putin regime is that it has sort of closed off the commanding heights of the Russian economy to foreigners, and it's really taken them back into state ownership. And, of course, if you're thinking about foreign policy agendas, I'm sure that that's been quite an aggravator for the West. So in terms of those types of relations, certainly, my view is that it's really Putin's objective there. It's about creating some sort of parity where he can say, look, we should be spoken to in polite terms, and we should be seen. I think that's right. I think in Syria they want to be seen as peace brokers, as people who'll be brought to the table seriously to actually help manage the situation in the Middle East. So it's really been back on the world stage. I don't see it any more than that necessarily in terms of some nefarious aim to dismantle the West or get in there into the nooks and crannies of the European Union. I think it's more just that sort of general overriding desire to be taken seriously as a world player. Of course, how they do that is unfortunately by flexing muscles rather than sort of the promotion of Russian culture and language.
Well, I was going to say that because there's McDonald's in Moscow, but we don't have the Moscow bit. It's more the West infiltrating and culturally.
Unfortunately, they do a really great baked potato.
Yes,
but it is much more, seems to me, the West infiltrating Russia and their culture and their than the opposite way about. I don't.
Yeah, and I mean the real big question is this: what they call the near abroad. So this is Central Asia and the Caucasus and the Baltic states, and for them, I mean, it's very clear they're losing the cultural war there in terms of what people are consuming, the languages that people are speaking. So if you go to a place like Georgia today, kids are speaking English, they're consuming Hollywood films. The Russian culture that came from the Soviet Union it's not dying off, but it's not as strong as it was. So if you talk about that sort of cultural soft power diplomacy, that ability to influence those countries in that way, it's not really there. So they're doing a lot of this, I would say, utilising military might basically to keep those countries within their orbit.
In terms of what Britain can do about it, Alison, I heard Philip Hammond on television this morning, and I suppose it talks to Brexit because there were certain things that he said Britain could do on its own, but very many of the things that Britain could now do would require support from European partners and sometimes the permission of Europe. Does it feel as if Britain's heading for a kind of much more isolated position when it has to deal with things like this?
And I think if you look at states that have really gone down an isolationist route, and I would then name Eritrea and North Korea, it doesn't look good, and it's not a great way of making friends. And certainly in a world where we are deeply dependent on one another at every level. And the more that we see the collapse of various forms of support and welfare and agreements, and the more we see a rule of law that's starting to be challenged or just ignored, as we see with e-scooter and as we've seen with other areas, then your social security is very much based with the people that you're in relationship with. And so for ordinary people, this is quite a fearful time. It's about saying, well, how are we actually going to stay and have good relations with one another so that we can actually continue to live well? And I think that also magnifies itself at state level. And I think the new alliances, the rise of the far right, the alliances between the Trump regime and the Putin regime are reorganizing the way we understand international politics in ways that we're only at the beginning of even analysing. We're only just over a year in to the Trump regime in the United States and seeing how that is working itself out and what that means. We're only just over a year and a half post-Brexit vote.
Yeah.
We don't yet know, and it's clear to me that this isn't something that anyone's been particularly good at doing for a long time. This isn't practiced politics. This is a lot of emergency thinking. And so for me, I often think of the fantastic work of a woman called Elaine Scarry, who is Harvard Professor of Thought, which is a wonderful title.
Oh, lovely.
And she did a series of lectures, the Amnesty International lectures, a few years ago, and she wrote a book called Thinking in an Emergency. And she just showed how bad emergency measures and emergency thinking are, because they're not practiced.
No.
Because people are kind of thinking out of the wrong bit of their brain.
Well, I was going to say that's up front, the bit,
Exactly.
isn't it? I read a book,
and out of the limbic
me.
stem,
Yeah.
and they're not actually
It's that
thinking
front
in
bit of
ways
your
which
brain.
they've practiced and which have become almost motorised for them. So that things like the debates in parliamentary democracy that we practice, that have their own rituals and codes, and we all get a little bit bored by, they actually, at times of crisis, they hold us, and they mean that we've got civil ways of addressing each other over things we disagree with. And she demonstrates that in beautiful ways with some really amazing stories, from grain fires in Canada to the practice in Switzerland of knowing what to do in the event of a nuclear attack, and that different members of society will have to do little tasks of their own in the event of an attack, and how that's practiced on an annual basis, and that when we practice things we know how to be. And what I think we keep seeing is very much the management by chaos. The generation of chaos, the generation and the attention to stories that have this frisson, like the case that we're looking at with a poisoning of a Russian spy, that then goes into being looked at, and people move into the fictional playbook rather than the playbooks of careful, quiet, sane, good debate, which may not be highly dramatised and which may well look like people are arguing about niceties of particular articles of law, but actually these are articles that have been laid down in peacetime in order to protect us. They are things that have been good for us so that we know how to deal with them. And I think a really good example of that is Article 1 of the Council of Europe, which was developed for saying what would happen in the event of a major war on the borders of Europe. And of course we've had a major war on the borders of Europe with the Syrian war, with the Syrian civil war, and what happens if a lot of people need protection, and there is an article that has now been set aside and where emergency thinking largely is predominating, except obviously in the example of Germany, where Germany then said, well, here we go, we've thought about this, we're going to do this, we'll take in 1 million refugees the first year, 200,000 this year. So I think there's a real place for this careful work of debate, lawmaking, democracy. And I think for me that brings us into things like the continuity bill that's currently, in many ways it's really quite a nerdy piece of legislation, and yet this strikes me as being very important for the ways in which democratic thinking and lawmaking can be made in an emergency, because it's about governance.
And about taking the medicine before you need it, and putting a plan into place. I serve on a couple of boards, and we all have way days and processes and thoughts, and if we disagree, how will we do it in respectful conversation, and what happens. And if you even bring it down to the simplest, what the man on the street can understand, don't text in a temper, go and make a cup of tea first. It comes right down to your own, because when you act as a person, you act at the front of your brain, it's really the right decision. Or if you're banging off an angry email to your boss, leave it in your outbox till the next day, reread it. And this is now.
Never tweet it.
Don't drink and tweet, but it's but it's this, as you say, and it's down to people even, and you can reckon. I think if you can bring it down to the point where people recognise in their own life that they react like that, but grown-up countries and presidents should not be behaving in such a way especially when there is statutes. It calls to mind, I don't know if you remember that really funny video with what's the actor's name? Captain Luke Picard, and he did the European, the satire video. Did you see it?
Patrick Stewart.
Patrick Stewart. Did you see that one before the Brexit vote? And it was, what have they ever done for us? And they get to the very so they get to the very point, and it was like, we should make our own human rights. And well, we did, and it's like it's all been thrown away.
It would have been better if he'd been dressed up as Captain Luke Picard.
It would have been much better, but Patrick Stewart. I do apologise to Patrick Stewart, but he's Captain Luke Picard to me. But that's this throwing away and of, well, it's actually there. We did it. Let's just open the book.
Moving on from Brexit, which we'll no doubt return to every week for time immemorial. International Women's Day was last week. How did you spend it, Alison? Did you have a busy day?
I had an amazing day, and I had a very busy day. It started with, I had messages when I woke up on my phone. There were messages from the Gaza Strip, there were messages from Uganda, and there were messages from Aotearoa, New Zealand, from women and men wishing me a happy International Women's Day, and from Uganda and the Gaza Strip reminding me that there it's a national holiday. And wondering when Scotland might get round to having International Women's Day as a national holiday, which I thought was an interesting question, and will raise many a debate.
How long did it take, Alison, before you read someone, or did you? Maybe this is the first year ever. How long is it before you seen a man saying when's International Man's Day? Usually it takes about 10 minutes.
Yeah, that was around about 8 o'clock in the morning, and it happens to be.
There is actually always
and it happens to be my birthday.
So original.
It happens to be my birthday, International Man's Day. So but I think for me, it was a wonderful day, and so I went to the picket line. Obviously, at the moment, the universities are on strike, and I'm a member of UCU, so I'm on strike. So picket line, lots of students have been offering huge solidarity to those of us who are staff in universities who are striking over the pensions. Much debate on the picket line about pensions as a gendered issue. Obviously, there's the WASPy generation, but there's also all those issues around women's pay in pension terms being less than men's pay, and the gender pay gap yet again affecting women more, and lots of stuff around period poverty, so lots of collections by students on the picket lines. And then we had a big event at Hillhead Library organised by the union, so 4 fantastic women speakers, particularly wonderful, the woman from the women's strike in Spain, Carmen, who was speaking there, but also 2 women, Dania and Yvonne, who are running the Ubuntu Women's Shelter, which is a shelter for asylum-seeking women who are destitute in Glasgow that they're setting up, and they're setting up on a skills share. So if anybody has skills they want to offer to actually help with that, I'm sure they'd be really delighted. The Ubuntu Women's Shelter, there's a Facebook site, and the hashtag, the Twitter address is at Ubuntu Glasgow.
We'll make sure that's retweeted.
And they're a wonderful initiative run by women for women, and really letting a lot of asylum-seeking women who obviously don't have the right to work, but have the ability to run this shelter for themselves, and therefore keep their skills alive or learn new skills. Really fantastic project. And then obviously Professor Lynn Abrahams was talking about the history of International Women's Day, and lots of people came up from the Mary Barber statue unveiling. And
I was furious.
So wonderful stuff going on. And I think for me, I did a piece in the National that day on the links between what was happening on the picket lines for us as exercising our right to strike, and all the students bringing food and baked goodies. I mean, these, honestly, our students should win Bake Off or do a cookbook. They're amazing. And it's been a real feast on the picket lines. But then I spent International Women's Day fasting, and I joined the Freedom Fast in solidarity with the 100 women in Yarlswood Immigration Removal Centre who were on hunger strike. And they're not visible. And their rights are so curtailed, so they aren't enjoying the right to protest in the public space in the way that I have that right, thanks to my great-grandmother and others who campaigned for that right. And so I joined them in that one day of solidarity. And I think, again, some really amazing websites, blogs and Twitter feeds to follow would be around Detained Voices, where those people on hunger strike are telling their own story and we see their agency. And for me there was a real paralleling of the feasting that we've been experiencing with all these baked goods, and then the way in which women on hunger strike are taking the violence of the asylum system into their bodies as a way of making it visible. And were able to do so. And so that paralleling between food and the absence of food to me were very interesting.
Well, it's over, I'm trying to think, it must be 30 years, but instantly the minute anyone says hunger strike, I think of the H Block and Bobby Sands, and these names, again, male political prisoners exercising their right. But again, it's the male names. These women are not visible. Bobby Sands' name will live forever, rightly or wrongly, and whatever different people's views. I know how I view it, but a political prisoner. But his name is there, we know him, he's recognised, he's heard of, if you see it, everyone will know who you're talking about, and these women, again, are invisible.
Yeah. And what it means, when you are so desperate that you are prepared to go to that length to deny your body of nutrients, because the nutrients of compassion are being denied to you within the asylum system that we have at the moment, and your fear, you would rather do this than be returned home. I think those, to me, they're very poignant stories. And so that was a really unusual way of spending International Women's Day.
I'll be looking at that, definitely.
Yeah.
How are you finding, Gavin, sort of public attitudes to the pension?
Can we stop? Can we ask Gavin what you did on International Women's Day?
What did you do at International Women's Day?
No, but I know this matters, but we will not do this without men.
Yeah.
We will not change the paradigm without male allies. It's
Absolutely
not a women's only issue. It's not just for Alison. Sorry to tell you, it's not just for Alison and I to talk about. So.
Well,
panic,
I hate to, I seem obsessed with Vladimir Putin, but I watched Vladimir Putin's address to women on the internet. It's very interesting because, if I'm right, Alison, the history of International Women's Day, it was very strong from communist countries and socialist countries. Is that where it originally emerged?
Yeah.
So it's a huge thing in the former Soviet Union. So when I lived out there, it was you get a really big holiday again.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
my colleagues are doing some work in Kazakhstan at the moment. You've got a couple of colleagues there, and they're completely off, and they enjoy themselves. International Women's Day, they get a couple of days off.
Yeah.
It's a huge thing. And I talked to a Kazakh guy who was telling me how upset he was that last year he was in Germany for International Women's Day.
And he was working.
Yeah, well, they don't celebrate it. It's not, it's not a thing there. So Putin always makes an address. So it's, to be honest, it's terrible in many ways because he reads this poem and it's really sickly and horrible.
And anyone that's ever been to a Pussy Riot show,
and that's it, yeah,
rolling their eyes heavenward, yeah.
But then also, if you just look at things like domestic violence rates in Russia, it's shocking. So there's this kind of contradiction out in Eastern Europe when it comes to this. So, being a good Central East European scholar, so go and watch some videos from over there, see what's happening over there. But I'm also on strike, so I was just. Spent some time in the snow.
Well, indeed, because I was interested in the strike aspect of it, how you're finding public opinion on that pension battle, because I think everybody has found their pensions coming under fire, and many people have seen its value being reduced.
Nice.
Exactly. I mean, are you getting people?
It's interesting. So people who work in the private sector, I do occasionally have some people who say, I don't get that type of contribution to my pension from my employer,
It's not a race to the bottom.
No, exactly. So occasionally you get that response. But to be honest, I'd reiterate what Alison said. First of all, the student response has been amazing. So there's incredible support. So I'd say thank you to all the students who support the strike. It's really amazing to see that and to feel that. But of course, people always do this when there are strikes, and that's part of our sort of neoliberal culture as well, where the people who strike, there are always some sectors and some sections of society that will ask, well, I don't get these benefits, why should these people get back to work?
I think pensions as well is one of those areas in which the government particularly can set one part of society against the other. Because it seems pensions, it seems to me that if we had renegotiated or just abandoned the deal we had made with the government, there would have been repercussions, but the government is quite able to completely throw out the deal they struck with us, so that our pensions are just destroyed. And
Down to being a citizen, isn't it? You've got rights and responsibilities,
Absolutely.
and you know, and this is not some sort of gift for theirs to give. This is this was a pact, a contract made by the people of the country.
I think, you know, my sense of the strike at the moment is that the employers have been caught completely unawares. They did not expect there to be 120 to 140 people on a picket line at Glasgow University every day. We're into the 4th week of the strike tomorrow. This is not easy. Being on strike isn't something that any of us want to do. It's always a last resort. And I think what then has also happened is that you've had some of the most intelligent people in the country with time, because they're on strike, to really do the analysis.
Yeah.
So the fantastic contribution of my colleagues who are accountancy experts, who are economics experts, who are experts on governance, who are experts on the ways in which the decisions have been made around pensions in the past, have gone to town with the time that they are using and have really exposed many of the difficulties of the neoliberal university. We've seen many a university, my own included, coming on side very closely with the union positions. My own principal saying there's very little to separate the positions, which is an extraordinary situation. This week we saw Oxford and Cambridge turn around from the positions that they'd had and do a complete U-turn. We have seen public apologies, not least from St Andrews, over the way it suggested that equality was just a nice luxury in universities.
My daughter's a first-year student.
So we've seen real work going on that I think has really exposed the problems that are highlighted in the universities, but we know are writ large across society at present.
Well, I think as well, you know, I read just the other day the Amon Anwar's big piece on support as well, and I think when you see university elite, as it were, coming out, it's so supportive. Do you think they've been caught on the back foot with how supported you are? You know, and which is, you know, I said my daughter's a first year student, and her and all her friends, they've got I support our lecturers T-shirts on, and they're really getting behind it. You know, and it's the one thing, isn't it, about such a Tory governments and right wing and Trump. What I quite like, I've really enjoyed some young American people. That it brings up that revolutionary spirit of studentdom again. I'm loving it. I like
people are making their own placards.
Exactly.
People
Not
are
watching the
making their own
Kardashians.
placards, and you know, I mean, there's nothing like a university strike. You know, our banners have footnotes. Our banners have footnotes.
Yeah.
On that note,
On that note.
we shall have to bring the discussion and the programme indeed to an end. I'd like to thank very much our guests for the contribution
Thank
today.
you.
Great talk.
Professor Alison Phipps and Professor Gavin Slade, thank you so very much for joining us.
Ending the show with some music by Erin Ponsonby. This was recorded during the programme Here and Now.
Which have been featured in an Emmy, do you think, Richard?
I don't know.
Brilliant.
I think she certainly lost her chance. So we shall enjoy this just now. Thank you very much for watching. We shall see you same time, same place next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
You used to be the center of my heart, but now all you do is tear my world apart. And baby, I miss you. I miss you and baby, I miss you. How could you say goodbye? You really felt that way. You used to be all that was on my mind. You used to be one of a kind, and baby, I miss you. I miss how we talked. Baby, I miss you, 'cause you were my rock. And those 3 words I was crying in my dreams. And baby, I miss you, even though you made me cry. And baby, I miss you, even though you lied. And those 3 words I told you not to say, those 3 words, unless you really felt that way, unless you really felt that way, unless you really felt that way. And those 3 words I never heard you say.